Hello, I'm David Myers. I teach Jewish history at UCLA and am a faculty affiliate of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. On behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome you to the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish Studies. Today's event features Professor Elissa Bemporad in a discussion about her new book, Legacy of Blood: Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets. Legacy of Blood is available through Oxford University Press and wherever books are sold. We're delighted today to be joined as well in our discussion by Boris Dralyuk, the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. We'd like to thank you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for virtual events like this. And I also want to extend my thanks to the great staff of the Levy Center for making the arrangements for today's event. In a minute, I'll invite Boris to begin our conversation with Elissa about Legacy of Blood, which is a powerfully researched and beautifully written book about the path of anti-Semitism in the newly created Soviet Union in the wake of the murderous violence at the end of the First World War, which was followed by a new but sadly brief era of state suppression of anti-Semitism. But first, let me introduce our two guests. First, Elissa Bemporad is the Jerry and William Unger Professor of Eastern European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She is the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, the Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk from 2013, which was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award and of the Fraenkel Prize in Contemporary History. Her second book, Legacy of Blood, about which we'll be talking today, also won a National Jewish Book Award in 2019. Professor Bemporad is the co-editor of two volumes, Women and Genocide: Survivors, Victims, Perpetrators from 2018 with Joyce Warren, and Pogroms, a documentary history of anti-Jewish violence, forthcoming with Oxford University Press with Gene Avrutin. And now Boris Dralyuk. In addition to being the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, he is an award-winning translator, including of the great Russian Jewish author Isaac Babel. Boris received his PhD in Slavic literature and language from UCLA and is the author of Western Crime Fiction Goes East, the Russian Pinkerton Craze from 2012. And he is the co-editor with Robert Chandler and Irene Mashinsky of the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. I'm now going to turn things over to Boris to begin our conversation.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, David. And it's really a great honor to be here. And I extend my thanks to the center as well. Elissa, I know that you've prepared a little bit of a presentation on the book. Is that right? Or would you rather? Perhaps yes. We can start there. Maybe you can present the book, and then I'll pose a few questions, and David will alternate with me.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I was truly looking forward to having this conversation about my new book in person, of course, and coming to LA, visiting UCLA. But I'm still very, very thankful to be able to do this via Zoom with the Zoom conversation. So thank you so much to the center, and thank you to David and Boris for being part of this. When months ago, I told my 10-year-old daughter the title of the book, Legacy of Blood: Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets, she stared at me, and then she said, "Please stop writing horror books." Now, hopefully those of you who have read or will read this book won't have the same reaction. But in many ways, my daughter was right. This is a story of violence, physical violence, rhetorical violence, actual and imagined violence. It's a story of how violence shapes identities, communities, memories, how violence affects relations with neighbors and with the state authorities within a specific geopolitical context, as well as the story of the way in which the role of the state has in sustaining a culture of violence. This book tells the story of pogroms and blood libels. There you have it, violence, right? The two most extreme manifestations of Tsarist anti-Semitism. And what I wanted to see was what happened to pogroms and blood libels after 1917 in the context of the Soviet Union. So the book traces the afterlife of these extreme manifestations of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. And by doing so, it sheds light on the broader question of the changing position of Jews in Soviet society. Now, I brought them together, ritual murder and pogroms, because they were often closely intertwined, interlaced in history and in memory, not least because the accusation of blood libel, the false allegation that Jews murder Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes, frequently triggered anti-Jewish violence. Such events were and are considered central to the Jewish experience in late Tsarist Russia. Think about Kishinev, 1903, the Baylis Affair, 1911, 1913. And of course, the Soviet regime boasted its break from the Tsarist period and proudly claimed to have eradicated these forms of anti-Semitism. But as I have discovered researching and writing this book, and I hope those of you will read it, will too, life was much more complicated. The persistence, the permutation, and the responses to anti-Jewish violence and memories of violence suggest that Jews who lived in the Soviet territories, and remember that we are talking about the second largest Jewish community in pre-Holocaust Europe, cohabited with a legacy of blood that has not been studied sufficiently, at least that has not been studied. Each chapter of this book engages with, I think, three themes that are crucial or key themes in modern Jewish history. First, each chapter tells the story of the relationship between Jews and the state. In the Soviet context, this was a solid relationship, but it was also ever-changing, and it was also at times ambivalent. Second, each chapter explores the social life of anti-Semitism, as I call it, social realities of everyday anti-Semitism in a society that never ceased to openly declare until the end that anti-Semitism belonged mostly to the past. And finally, each chapter tries to chronicle the emergence of communities of violence, of memories of violence, capturing the solidarity and the social cohesion among those who committed or intended to commit violence and those who suffered from it. So pogroms and blood libels, they were actually right there, right in front of me, in plain sight. Throughout my, these past 10 years, but I overlooked them in this specific context, in the Soviet context, assuming that it all disappeared in 1917. So I hope that by incorporating them into my work, that I have contributed to a better understanding of modern Jewish history. Those are my short remarks.
Thank you, Elissa. That's wonderful, and it leads right into my first question. I want to actually reiterate first what David said about the book. It is beautifully researched. I'll add that it's also concise and direct in an almost harrowing way. And this is what you just said is very important. That you've discovered this ghostly trail of pogroms and blood libels in the interwar Soviet period. We're familiar with anti-Jewish state violence in the last years of Stalin's reign, but the lingering reality of these phenomena in the 20s and 30s is something that I think your book teases out beautifully. I would like to ask, it seemed to me that the most original and convincing parts of that argument is that blood libel and the pogrom persisted in two ways. One, as a memory, of course, and one as a reality. And the reality was also kind of bifurcated. On the one hand, it was a form of expression. Bringing up the blood libel was a form of expression of anti-Sovietism, kind of covert anti-Sovietism. And on the other hand, the Soviet campaign against religion also perpetuated the imagery of the blood libel. So could you talk a little bit about that, about these ghostly trails of the blood libel and especially the blood libel, but also the pogrom in the 20s and 30s, how it persisted?
So I was actually very surprised when I first encountered an account of the blood libel in the Soviet context. Right? We've assumed that between the Baylis affair, 1913, and the Kielce pogrom of 1946, that these territories were largely, I would say, that the ritual murder accusation, blood libel, was largely absent. I was actually in Vilnius in 2007. I was reading the Soviet press in Belarusian and in Yiddish, and I came across this account of a blood libel accusation in 1937 in the city of Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. And I said, what, in the midst of the great purges, how can you have a ritual murder accusation? What was fascinating was the way in which the state responded to it, or the authorities responded to it, by organizing a trial against the accusers, right? In the midst of the great purges, when the assumption was that, Soviet citizens would have had other concerns on their minds, and the state too, the authorities too, those who make these accusations are taken to trial and are actually have to serve some prison sentence, a year and a half in 1937. So what I found is that these instances build on popular anti-Semitism. When we talk about anti-Semitism, we have to distinguish between state anti-Semitism and popular anti-Semitism. And especially in the interwar period, they are largely, while they are in conversation, they are largely separated, or the state tries to tame popular anti-Semitism. In the post-war period, it's something different, and we can come back to that. But what is so interesting is that, so the state from above condemns the blood libel, right? It was very clear how as soon as the Soviets enter Kiev, where the Baylis affair took place, they arrest all the Tsar's officials who were involved. Vera Chibiryak, who was the leader of this gang of thieves who actually killed the young Ukrainian boy, is shot in downtown Kiev. And you have several publications that address the fact that the blood libel is a no-no, that it is unacceptable. At the same time, at the popular level, as you pointed out, Boris, and that was so interesting when I found that out, that it is a form of resistance on the part of many Soviet citizens. It's something very familiar, especially, but not only, the millions of peasants who in the context of forced urbanization, enter the cities and for the first time encounter Jews in this new, visible, prominent position of power, resist by recalling that memory of blood libel. And it's very interesting to see how the local authorities respond to these accusations. They assume, in almost all cases, they assume that indeed it might have happened. So we have investigative commissions that are created. The police intervenes, the local authorities intervenes, and with the assumption that something might have happened, that Jews indeed might have carried out the murder for ritual purposes. So the tension between, again, central authorities who are condemning it and the local authorities at the regional and local level who might, who are uncertain as to how to respond, is very, very interesting in this context.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll just say before giving David the floor that we immigrated from the Soviet Union in the early 1990s from Odessa, which was a heavily Jewish town. And toward the end of the 1980s, precisely the same phenomenon occurred. The influx of people from villages, for the first time encountering Jews directly, led to these popular expressions of anti-Semitism that were so unfamiliar to Soviet Jews living in Odessa at the time. So now I'd like to give the floor to David.
Thank you, Boris. So, Elissa, I have to just convey to you my sense of surprise when I began to read the book. You begin by describing the horrific violence in the late stages and after the First World War, which would have been an order of magnitude of mass murder that would have been hard to grasp were it not for subsequent genocidal acts such as the Holocaust. But what's even more surprising, I mean, that piece is not surprising to know about 1919, the Civil War. What was surprising was to see how avid and rigorous the Soviet state was in suppressing anti-Semitism and these lingering forms of anti-Jewish expressions such as the blood libel and ritual murder accusations. And that sort of lent the impression, wow, this is going to be a really uplifting story. This is going to be a story of, the untold story of the Soviet state. Just completely identifying anti-Semitism with bourgeois reaction and stamping it out at every turn. But what is unraveled in the course of your story are at least two other slices, two other narrative threads relating to the state and anti-Semitism, with the Jews figuring prominently. One is the distinction made at a later point between rich and poor Jews, between bourgeois and proletariat Jews, which is one of the complications to which you referred to in your opening remarks. And then it seems even later is the wholesale association of Jews with the bourgeoisie. As we make our way into the early 1950s and the doctors plot the very familiar instances of the Soviet embrace of anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering if you can sort them out. So my initial surprise at the hope that, in fact, the story would demonstrate the suppression of anti-Semitism quickly yielded something more complicated, and then something much more complicated, but in a certain sense predictable, which is the wholesale association of Jews and bourgeois. How do these three narrative depictions interact with one another? Is it simply a matter of sequence? As we move further and further away from 1917, it gets more difficult for the Soviet state to simply condemn anti-Semitism, and easier to identify Jews in some way with a bourgeois element that seeks to undermine the state.
Mm-hmm. So that's an excellent question, David. Thank you for the question. And I mean, the first thing that I've discovered by writing this book, by researching and writing this book, is that there is really an unexplored story of anti-Semitism that I in a way, I academically, scholarly grew up with this, with the assumption that in the interwar period, the state fights against anti-Semitism. In the post-war period, it turns. It becomes much more open to accepting anti-Semitism from below and embracing it in a way. But in fact, it's much more complicated. I mean, as we know, Lenin outlawed anti-Semitism in 1918 in the midst of the Civil War. He shows, or he wants the Soviet state to show no tolerance for anti-Semitism. But this is what remains on paper, actually, until even in the 70s and the 80s, in the midst of the anti-Zionist campaigns, the Soviet Union, as we all know, will always say, we oppose anti-Semitism. But that ambivalence, that inherent ambivalence, is there from the very beginning. So I actually wouldn't distinguish too much Lenin from Stalin in a way, meaning that there is a double standard of condemning officially anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence in the context of the pogroms. At the same time, though, the state tries to avoid consistently discussing publicly anti-Semitism. So, for example, as I show in this kind of tension that emerges in the context of the memory of the pogroms, this very politicized memory of the pogroms, we have the pogrom as a Soviet lieu de mémoire, as a Soviet site of memory, whereby those who were killed were workers, peasants, people who supported the revolution. I'm sorry, those who were killed were, yes, those who were killed by the counter-revolution are the workers and the peasants who supported the revolution, and not necessarily Jews. Jews were not targeted in this violence. So, for example, the trials against the pogromchiki, against those who carried out the pogroms, yes, the outcome is perhaps, you know, prison sentence or concentration camp for those who committed the crime, but the term anti-Semitism is not used. So there is already an attempt to downplay or to cover up the issue of anti-Semitism. It's very nuanced. We address it openly, but actually the real issue in the context of the pogroms, for example, was, as you mentioned, David, was that the pogroms were in a way a folk movement. It was impossible to apply a class reading to this kind of violence, meaning that workers and peasants killed Jews, and they also killed Jewish workers and Jewish peasants in the colonies, actually. So it's impossible to apply this kind of class reading to the violence. The outcome is that that certain aspects of anti-Semitism are silenced, that the state will, in a way, pretend that anti-Semitism is not there, or that it is not such a major issue. So this kernel of ambivalence is there from the very beginning. And what happens is that the anti-Semitism is no longer an issue for the state once it clashes with the interests of the state. And the interests of the state, let's face it, in the post-genocidal years after the Civil War, just like in the post-genocidal years of World War II, is to build a new society and to emphasize, to create new bonds and kind of celebrate the brotherhood of people. So we don't want to dwell too much on the killings and the murder. So I think that this kernel of ambivalence is there from day one. I want to add one more thing. If we think about, you know, Lenin and Stalin, continuities and ruptures, the truth is, I think that pogroms, even more than ritual murder, was a problem for the Soviets, for the Soviet state, because the association between pogroms and Tsarist Russia was clear to everyone, and they wanted to both Lenin and Stalin wanted to distance themselves from that. So for them, actually, anti-Semitism exists when you have spontaneous violence, street violence against Jews, which doesn't happen in the Soviet Union, with few exceptions. You know, Stalin famously said in the, I can't remember, 1949, to Ilya Ehrenburg, who addresses him. He goes to him and he says, look, there's too much anti-Semitism. And Stalin says, please leave me alone. There is no anti-Semitism. Are there pogroms? No, there are no pogroms. Hence, there is no anti-Semitism.
Yes, the symbolic nature of that is very important for the state, exactly as you lay out. And I'm so glad that you brought up these two periods, that the commemorating the pogroms took the same shape as commemorating Babi Yar, for instance. These were crimes against Soviet citizens, not crimes against Jews per se. A question that relates to what David said is the changing social dimension of Jews in the Soviet state. And one of the ways that you tell the story, and I think a fascinating sidelight, is the changing role of women in the story of the blood libel in the 20s and 30s, both as victims and as purported perpetrators. Could you tell us a little bit more about the gendered element of the evolving gendered element of the ritual?
So this was, thank you, Boris, for the excellent question. This was also, you know, when I'm asked what was the most interesting discovery in the research you've conducted for this book? This is what I bring to the table. In terms of the history of the blood libel, the traditional, according to the traditional narrative, it is Jewish men. It's very gender, just like racism is gender. Jewish men kill a child, reenacting the killing of Christ. Now, in the modern period, and really the blood libel, as Jonathan Fraenkel was so right that it grows out of the anxiety of modern times. It is a byproduct of modern times. So it's so interesting to look at society and relationship between minority, majority group through the lenses of the blood libel. So one of the permutations, of course, is that towards the end of the 19th century, in Russia and in elsewhere in Central Europe, it's no longer exclusively the child who is being the alleged victim of this ritual, but it's a young woman. It's a young woman who symbolizes the nation, right? She embodies the nation. Think about, France, you have it throughout Western Europe, actually Western and Central Europe. It is Jews who defile and murder the nation. The sexual discourse is also there, also in the visual, in some of the visuals. And the other instance of the other element of that kind of gives us a sense of this modernization of the ritual murder accusation is that for the very first time, I haven't seen it in any other geopolitical context, Jewish women become the alleged perpetrators only in the Soviet context. So this reflects, we always, when we talk about racism, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we're always weighing, myth, reality. In a way, I thought a lot about this, and it reflects its wounded masculinity in the context of a Soviet society that violated its own citizens, wounded masculinities of Ukrainian peasants, Belarusian peasants, not only peasants, but, especially the peasantry that moves into the cities. And also the empowerment of Jewish women. Jewish women become very visible, or it's a novelty that they're so visible, especially vis-a-vis Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian women. So wherever I turn around, I see a Jewish woman in a position of political leadership or in a position of, managerial, administrative responsibility. And again, the response or the blood libel accusation is used as a response to punish Jewish women for their uppity ways, right? For this new kind of empowerment. And this is, again, myth, reality for Jewish women who already, like Jewish men, were more literate and more urban compared to non-Jewish women and non-Jewish men in Soviet society. The Soviet Union represented or gave extraordinary opportunities of upward mobility. So that is a fact. And it's so interesting how this fact becomes incorporated into the one of the worst anti-Semitic myths in human history.
Absolutely. David, would you like to follow up?
Sure. I just want to add before I pose a question that there's so many interesting gender dimensions to the story that it's almost its own story, in and of itself. Certainly, I was intrigued by this figure, Rachel Feinberg, as a chronicler of, as a witness and chronicler of the violence in Odessa. You make an extraordinarily powerful case about the enormity and both symbolic and actual significance of rape as a tool of regulative and performative violence. There are many, many rich threads that make up a kind of subtext throughout the story. And I wonder how, through the lens of gender history, the following question might be posed. One of the things that you return to repeatedly is the importance of the power of a centralized state, as opposed to a disaggregated, kind of nihilistic, anarchic, lawless, chaotic, stateless polity or lack thereof, in which the bloodlands can go about their work of mass murder. That is, as you know very well, Lisa, a longstanding motif in Jewish history that extends back to what my teacher, Professor Yerushalmi, called the vertical or royal alliance, the alliance of Jews with state power. Scholars of antiquity note a triangle of power in which Jews often align themselves with state power. I'm wondering, and of course, Hannah Arendt regarded that very alliance as a writ of suicide, as it were, when it came to that dependence in the Second World War. I wonder if you can elaborate on the importance of that vertical alliance in your story. And maybe, I don't know, is there a gendered perspective to shed even additional light on it that you can see?
Thank you for the question. Another excellent question. You guys are, excellent questions.
Such an engaging book, Lisa. Such a powerful, engaging book.
I completely agree.
Thank you. Thank you to both. It's very interesting that I was reading Yerushalmi a few years ago when I was trying to conceptualize what happened in the midst and in the aftermath of the Civil War, in the context of these pogroms that led to perhaps as many as 150,000 Jews murdered, 300,000 Jewish orphans, as many as 1/3 of Jewish women were raped, perhaps 1 in 12 in the context of Ukraine in particular, where you have the epicenter of violence. And I was really trying to conceptualize, besides lieu de mémoire, besides, what is the politicization of this memory, what did it mean to, thousands of Jews left the Soviet Union, like Rochel Feigenberg, who you mentioned, David, who is one of the reasons why I decided to work on the pogroms. She really she drew me in with her voice, but she left. But most of the Jews who experienced this violence stayed. So what did it do to them? And so I was reading Yerushalmi at the same time, and I said, oh, it's the royal alliance. It's the vertical alliance. In a way, Jews choose to align themselves with the state, with the Soviet state, with the central authorities, the central power, because out of protection. It's protection. It's also revenge. I would emphasize. Many joined the Red Army, the Cheka, to avenge the members of their families who were slaughtered. So it's not only an ideological choice. That was my, one of my goals was to emphasize that it's not all about, the reading that Yuri Slioskin presents, that is, otherwise a very powerful paradigm that he presents us in the Jewish century, but it's also limiting. It's not that Jews became Soviets because of this enthusiasm, because they believed in communism and they were eager to participate in the new system, in the state, and upward mobility. It's not only that. There also is trauma. There also is this seeking protection and seeking revenge. For most Jews, it's the lesser of two evils. It's not an ideological choice. And I think Yerushalmi was crucial for me to conceptualize this. Of course, in the pre-modern time, the state or the king seeks this alliance with the Jews because of economic interest, primarily. In the Soviet case, it's not economic interest, it's political interest. The Soviets needed a literate, urban elite, group of people who could become a political elite and could be loyal. And so then I brought in Anna Arendt also, and her resentment towards those Jews who aligned themselves with the centers of power. But I feel of course, she's primarily addressing the German context, Nazi Germany. But I felt like at the time, there wasn't enough emphasis on the emotions that, the pain, the emotion, and the trauma that led so many to embrace this choice. A gendered reading of the Royal Alliance or the Vertical Alliance, I'm not sure. What I can say, David, is that, in the many, many accounts of rape that I have read, it's very clear that rape, or the attempt to protect sisters, daughters from future rape, or the potential future rape, is one of the driving forces of the demographic revolution that takes place in after the Civil War, meaning that we have to get out of here as quickly as possible, resettle to the larger cities where our daughters and sisters will not be raped. The other point that I found very interesting when thinking about women was a reminder of the fact that a response to trauma is not always remembering, but it can often be forgetting, oblivion, right? Erasing the memory. So the successful horizontal socialization, which took place, right, in the Soviet Union, very successful acculturation, assimilation, is also a response to that trauma. And intermarriage elsewhere is also a response to that kind of trauma.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's a brilliant response. I have we have about 15 minutes left, so I'd like to ask a question that comes from the heart. In this case, reading this book, I've noticed that you've cited quite a few literary texts, but most of them are memoiristic, journalistic. There are some works of artistic literature in Yiddish that you cite, but the whole time, until I came to page 109, when Babel was mentioned, I kept thinking of Babel. I kept thinking of all of the depictions of precisely what you've just said, the mix of motivations behind Jewish alliances with power, revenge mixed with ideological conviction, the internal contradictions that breeds. And I'm wondering whether you too made use of some of the literary refractions of this phenomenon as you were working on the book. Did you go to literary sources that perhaps you couldn't include in this work of history, but that helped you conceive of what was happening at an emotional level?
That's a very powerful, and in a way, yes, it is a personal question in a way. What I did was, in the beginning, I tried to stay, to hear the voices of, for example, in the context of the pogroms, the voices of the survivors, of the refugees, those voices that were recorded so systematically, so meticulously by Elias Cherikover. And I tried to stick to those voices without bringing in the literature, but then I thought, this is not right. I mean, literature, it was produced at the time. These were people who experienced themselves. Babel, I should have engaged more with Babel. I should have.
This wasn't meant as a critique.
I should have brought Babel more into the story. No, I think I should have, because the reader is much more familiar with Babel than with Kipnis, for example, who wrote this very powerful Days and Months about the pogrom in Slovenia that he himself witnessed. But where where I think I bridge this gap between literature and history, or literature and archives, is really through Rocho Feigenberg, who, she was a Yiddish writer. She was actually, she was part of the Bohemian Circle of Writers in Warsaw. And then she moved to Odessa. She kept writing. She met the literary critic Spector, who became very close to. They became very close, and she, because of her skills as a writer, Cherikover invited her to participate in this group of journalists and historians who were sent out to collect information, but also to write accounts about the destruction of different towns and cities. And she is, what I did, I compared the report that she writes for Cherikover, and this very detailed report of the destruction, especially of one shtetl, Dubove, or Dubova, not too far from Uman, was used even as evidence for the Schwarzbard trial in Paris against Schwarzbard, who assassinated Petliura. And it's very, it's very historic, right? It's a collection of data. She interviewed the refugees, the survivors of Dubova, and she put this together. But then what she did is she wrote a literary account that is very beautiful, very belletristic in a way. And I used that. That was published in Yiddish in 1926 in Warsaw, and then in Leningrad, I almost said St. Petersburg, in Leningrad in 1929 in Russian translation. So this is, I think that her voice was so important also because she brings together more than what Babel would have been able to do, a literary voice with a historical voice, with the voice of someone who's consciously creating or writing the history of a destroyed center so that it will remain. And in fact, had it not been for her, we would know nothing about Dubove besides the fact that it was the birthplace of Berdichevsky and his father, the rabbi who was killed during the pogrom.
Yes, I completely agree. Her voice is central to this narrative, and really gives it that third dimension, that emotional dimension. And David pointed that out earlier. Yeah, she will stay with us.
Absolutely. So I have too many questions, Elissa, and not enough time. I'm going to ask you one now, and the one that combines two questions, and then maybe one final question. The question that I'm going to combine is really a question about two kind of surprising discoveries that you make, or revelations to me at least. One is the persistence of ritual murder accusations and the blood libel in Central Asia, well into the Soviet period. At a time when many of us have this kind of romanticized image of Central Asia as the site of refuge of hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews. And here, surfacing in a completely different context than the normal one, a Muslim-dominant context, is the blood libel alongside ritual murder accusations. So that's one very surprising geopolitical insight that you offer. The other is just a kind of conceptual revelation that I hadn't thought of, and it's related to the increasing, I'd say, intolerance of Jews that we see in the Soviet Union, sort of the shift of the pendulum away from that erstwhile moment of suppression of anti-Semitism as a high state priority. And that is what you call the villagization of the city. A really interesting idea where you have, those people from, the villages and towns, maybe armed with, very deeply rooted anti-Semitic ideas, making their way to the site of what seemed to be liberation from anti-Semitism in the city, and complicating the matter tremendously. So these two interesting geopolitical sites, Central Asia and the villagized city. I wonder if you could speak to both of them.
Central Asia, I must say that I was also very surprised when I found out about the fact that there were ritual murder accusations that turned into, or that led to a pogrom in Central Asia, where you have Jews who are actually attacked on the street. And this goes back to the fact that the state is not as powerful and as well organized, the state infrastructure in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, as it is in the European region of the Soviet Union. So you have 1920, 26, 28, 29, these pogroms, and I'm wondering, why do we have this blood libel accusation? You know, it's a Christian myth. But then, in fact, you know, I started reading more, even secondary literature. Mordechai Altshuler, his book on the Caucasus, and he talks about the actually instances of blood libel. First of all, there was knowledge of the Damascus affair of 1840. The Kutaisi, also the Kutaisi blood libel of 1879, the one that Dostoevsky also believed was true. So you know, and the Beilis affair, there was information about the Beilis affair in this region. So this region was not, you know, there was information about this alleged murder that Jews, you know, once in a while carried out. And this is echoed in those cases that take place in the 1920s. There is a reference to the Beilis affair. There is a reference to Kutaisi in Georgia. What is interesting is that, you know, the Christian child becomes the Muslim child. And it's very, you know, it just happens. It's almost natural how it happens. And that was very surprising. If we think about Central Asia in the context of the war, and in, you know, beginning in 1943, as you said, thousands and thousands of Jews from Ukraine and from other areas fled there and found refuge there. What I found is that, first of all, another example of how ritual murder permutates, right, and changes. In this context, it's cannibalism. It's pure cannibalism. Jews are accused of kidnapping children and turning their bodies into food, sausage, or. But the tension there is not so much between the Jews who came from Ukraine and local Muslims. It's actually, the tension is between the Russians who also came there and the Jews who came there. So I think there is in this cultural tension, this Kulturkampf in a way, is being brought to Central Asia in the context of the war by these two groups that move there. It's not so much, again, it's not so much as far as I could see, and I think, you know, Central Asia, the Caucasus, these are, you know, there are a lot of archives that are not open. Forget about COVID, they're generally not open. So I think there's a lot to explore there. And I think that the work of my friend Eileen Kane, who is now focusing on the relationship between Jews and Muslims in the Soviet context, not so much in Central Asia, but she might go to Central Asia as well eventually, will help us understand better also how this, you know, how this myth, you know, emigrated from Ukraine to Central Asia. In terms of this other geopolitical context, the city as a village, this is, you know, Moshe Levin wrote extensively about this, and he wasn't too happy about it because he said that the peasants were resisted very much Sovietization, and that is true. I think that, again, as I just to follow up on the question that Boris asked earlier, for the peasants, it is, there's a lot of trauma that this forced urbanization involves. The collapse of patriarchal society, the family structure, the new family laws, the new family code, the celebration of intermarriage. A traditional Ukrainian family does not really want their daughter to marry a Pole. Forget about a Jew, but even a Pole. So there's a lot of anxiety here. And what I found very interesting here is that again, the Jew is in a new position, in a visible position, and embodies the threat of the system. This is where you have Judeo-Bolshevism in the city. And this is actually a new phenomenon for the peasants, right? Who are exposed to this myth for the first time in the cities. And identify the Jews as this colonial force in the cities where they are forced to accept and Soviet tenets and Sovietize violently.
Well, this brings me directly to my next question, which takes us into the contemporary sphere. Everything that you've just said about the rupture in the lives of Ukrainian peasants, let's say, I think strikes me as completely accurate. But it also brings me to the very end of your book, at which point you make a poignant and provocative suggestion that the LGBTQ community are the new Jews in the Soviet lands. And it struck me as I finished the book that is a really fertile realm for discussion, because in more ways than one do they represent the same forces to, let's say, the Russian imaginary that the Jews represented earlier. Could you just talk a little bit about that? And then I think we have time for one more question after that, and we'll have to end this, although I could keep going for hours.
Thank you, Boris. So, the conclusion, the conclusion of the book is I ponder the legacy of this violence in the contemporary world. And I'm looking at Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, not so much Central Asia, but, and I'm thinking, I wrote this also in the midst of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the extent to which Putin was exploiting the memory of these pogroms to emphasize the fact that all Ukrainians, one could not trust Ukrainians because they had behaved in a certain way against Jews in the context of World War II. And I'm thinking, so what is it going to be? Are Jews still susceptible to these two, to ethnic violence, spontaneous violence, and to the accusation of ritual murder? The accusation of ritual murder does still exist, but I would say it's mostly marginal. But the violence, I think that there are other groups that can be the ideal target of this kind of violence that comes from below, that is not tamed from above. Other ethnic minorities and the LGBTQ community that faces persecution from above and from below in the context of Russia. So I thought, there's much more to study, I think, and I hope that historians, anthropologists, ethnographers will actually take up that kind of, the parallel, or this kind of to better understand the situation of the LGBT community today, to look back and think about Jews and the condition of Jews in Tsarist Russia and in the Soviet Union.
As absolutely, especially as disruptors of the traditional structures, of traditional family structures and bonds, and very gendered bodies in peculiar ways. And I'll give the last question to David.
Thank you, Boris. Thinking about legacy, we often are struck by the enormity of the legacy of the Holocaust, especially when studying Eastern European Jewish history. But it seems to me that one of the really powerful things you do in this book, Elissa, is to offer a reception history not only of the blood libel and ritual murder accusations to the Soviet era, but really a reception history of 1919, which is in some sense the great forgotten, neglected, marginalized tragedy in 20th century Jewish history, when perhaps as many as 150,000 people were killed, Jews were killed in the midst of just blood-curdling, chaotic, lawless violence. And I often wonder, in part stimulated by students who have suggested this, including and especially our student at UCLA, Mark Smith, who's written a wonderful book on Yiddish historians during the Holocaust, whether 1919 isn't, in fact, a template for many, a prototype for things that will come, including mass murder, contestation over memory, the erasure of Jews from historical narratives, and in that matter that occupied Mark's attention, what is referred to as Chorbenforschung, research devoted to mass destruction. That is to say, 1919 as an adumbration of much that will come, including the field of Holocaust studies, when we think of the contributions of Cherikover and Dubnov from that period of 1919 to 1923. I'm wondering if you see 1919 as echoing and reverberating in this way, and what its legacy is to us today.
Absolutely. I think that 1919 represents a turning point. The experience, first of all, from the vantage point of the victims, the experience in certain places was very similar to the experience of Jews in the context of the Holocaust. When I found out about the hiding places that Jews built in the Shtetlach that were surrounded by Ukrainian forces or the white forces, where they were in hiding for 2 months with these very complicated air shafts that were built. The pogroms, these 150,000 Jews who lost their lives, were killed in military pogroms. Many of these pogroms were military, but they were also killed by their neighbors killing neighbors, which is also something that will, take place in the context of the bloodlands. This experience also prepared writers who experienced both periods to write about the Holocaust. Think about Ilya Ehrenburg, who witnessed the violence in Kiev and then, participated in the extraordinary project of the Black Book of Soviet Jewry. Kipnis, also I mentioned earlier, he was, the literature of the Ravine that becomes so important after the Holocaust is already here. In Incipit is here. And I think that Dubnov and Cherikov, had they survived, they would have looked back to this experience that they both researched and wrote about to write about the Holocaust. One difference, I think, lies in the fact that in the immediate aftermath of this Churban, of the Civil War, the voices of the victims are collected immediately. The voices of, refugees, of the survivors, immediately 1 month after, 2 weeks after, we see Feigenberg in Odessa, Cherikov himself, who's going from place to place, and has people going from place to place to collect these voices. This is something that does not take place immediately after the Holocaust. This is where I see a difference. But there's so many parallels. There's so many between 1919 and 1941 that and again, I want to go back to Dubnov, who's one of the reasons, his work is one of the reasons why I became interested in Russian Jews. I think that he would have looked back at this Churban in order to better understand and study. And so I think that first of all, there are several scholars who are looking at 1919 much closer. But what I hope that Holocaust scholars of the Holocaust will do the same, and scholars of other genocide will do the same. In order to better understand the Shoah, they should look also at how things developed, relationship between neighbors and power structures in the context of 1919, 1921.
Well, before handing things back to Boris for a final word, I just want to say that this conversation is in many ways a continuation of my experience reading the book, which I can't call pleasurable because of the subject matter, but was enormously illuminating and really a unique kind of scholarly thrill, because you managed to strike a balance between two seeming opposites, which is to say, an enormous economy of language and concision on one hand, and a kind of exhaustiveness that lends the reader a sense of the entire subject having been comprehended. You tell this extraordinarily rich story with such vividness that one really felt a part of the story in a very palpable way. So thank you for the conversation. Thank you for the book. And on behalf of the UCLA Levy Center, thank you for making time out of your schedule. Boris.
Well, I won't do any better than David. I think he said everything that I felt as I read the book. I'll only add that every page of this book pointed in 1,000 directions for future research, and that was also thrilling. It not only did it provoke thought, it also provoked hope that more scholars will follow in your footsteps and develop on these themes. So thank you for your time. I wish I had more time to spend with you today, and thank you, David, for involving me in this conversation. Thank you to the center.
And thank you so much to both of you. Extraordinary questions, and I really appreciate the way in which you read this book.